I can still picture the moment when everything started to fall apart, even though at the time it seemed like nothing more than a small, uncomfortable misunderstanding. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in early October. Nothing special about it. Nothing dramatic. Just another ordinary night in the life my wife Megan and I had built together over the past 8 years. We had finished dinner about an hour earlier. Megan had been unusually tired lately, blaming it on a demanding new campaign at the advertising agency where she worked. Long meetings, tight deadlines, late-night calls with clients from different time zones. At least that's how she explained it. I didn't question it. Her job had always been intense. That evening she had curled up on the couch with her laptop, saying she needed to finish sending a few emails before tomorrow's meeting. I remember sitting at the kitchen table answering a few work messages of my own. I worked as an engineer, and most of my evenings were usually quiet, spreadsheets, designs, routine planning. Eventually the house went silent. When I looked over toward the living room, Megan had fallen asleep. Her laptop was still open on the coffee table in front of her. The glow of the screen lit up the dim room while the TV played some half-forgotten show in the background. She looked peaceful. I remember smiling slightly at the sight of her there, wrapped in a blanket, breathing slowly. Moments like that always reminded me why I loved the quiet simplicity of our life together. I stood up from the kitchen table to grab my phone charger from the living room. That was it. Just one normal movement. If I had taken a slightly different path across the room, or if the laptop screen had dimmed a few seconds earlier, maybe none of what happened next would have happened. But as I walked past the coffee table, something on the screen caught my eye. An email window was open. At the top of the message was a name I recognized immediately. Tyler. Megan had mentioned him a few times before, a coworker from her team. From what she told me, he was one of the account managers working on the same project she had been traveling for recently. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention, but a single line from the email stood out. Something about it made my steps slow. I told myself not to read it, but my eyes moved anyway. The message wasn't long, just a few short paragraphs. Yet the tone was strange. Tyler wrote about the business trip Megan had taken the previous week to Chicago for a marketing conference. That part wasn't unusual. She had talked about the trip when she came back, the hotel, the meetings, the networking events. But then the email shifted. He mentioned how he still couldn't stop thinking about that night after the conference ended. He joked about the hotel bar closing earlier than expected. Then came the sentence that made my stomach tighten. He wrote that it was probably for the best, because otherwise they might never have ended up continuing the night upstairs. There were other small details too. References to the view from the hotel window. A comment about how neither of them had expected the night to turn out the way it did. And at the very end of the message, a line that felt painfully out of place in what was supposed to be a professional conversation. Still smiling about it. For a moment I just stood there, staring at the screen. My brain tried to assemble the words into something harmless. Maybe he was joking. Maybe it was sarcasm. Maybe a group of coworkers had stayed out late together and I was simply misunderstanding the context. But something about the tone of the message felt personal. Too personal. It didn't sound like two colleagues talking about work. It sounded like two people remembering something private. Something they shared. Something that didn't involve anyone else. Jack. Her voice cut through the silence. I flinched slightly. Megan had woken up. She pushed herself upright on the couch, blinking sleepily as she looked toward me. For a brief moment her gaze moved past me, straight to the laptop screen, then back to my face. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry, just confused, maybe slightly irritated. I hesitated. "I saw an email," I said carefully. She reached forward and slowly closed the laptop halfway. "From Tyler." The room suddenly felt smaller. Megan rubbed her forehead like she was trying to wake herself up properly. "Okay," she said. "And," I took a breath. "He mentioned your trip to Chicago. Something about continuing the night upstairs." For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone. She leaned back against the couch and let out a quiet sigh. "Jack," she said calmly, "were you reading my work emails?" I wasn't snooping, I replied quickly. It was open. I just glanced at it. You misunderstood. The confidence in her voice came immediately. There was no hesitation. That email is about a client dinner, she continued. The whole team went out after the conference. Tyler has a weird sense of humor. He always exaggerates things. I frowned slightly, but it sounded like, "Oh my God," she interrupted, shaking her head. "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "Overthinking everything." She folded her arms and looked at me with the kind of tired expression someone uses when explaining something obvious. "Jack, I work in advertising. My job literally requires constant communication with coworkers. We travel together. We meet clients late at night. Sometimes we even stay in the same hotels during conferences." "I know that," I said. "Then why are you acting like this email is some kind of scandal?" I didn't answer, because the truth was, I didn't really know why it bothered me so much. Maybe it was the tone of the message. Maybe it was the way she reacted so quickly. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something deeper. She looked at me for a few seconds longer, then softened her voice. "You trust me, right?" The question hung in the air between us. Finally, I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "Of course I do." She smiled slightly, opened the laptop again, and went back to her emails like the conversation had never happened. But as I walked back into the kitchen, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. I told her I believed her. I even tried to convince myself that I did. But somewhere deep in the back of my mind, a quiet thought had already started forming. A thought that would grow louder with every passing day. Because that night, for the first time in our marriage, I began to wonder if my wife was hiding something from me. For the rest of that night, I tried to act normal. Megan stayed on the couch answering emails for another half hour while I washed the dishes in the kitchen. Every now and then she laughed quietly at something on her screen or muttered about deadlines and clients. To anyone looking in from the outside, we probably looked like a perfectly ordinary couple finishing up an ordinary evening. But my mind refused to settle. The words from that email kept replaying over and over in my head. Still smiling about it. It was such a small phrase. Yet something about it refused to fit into the explanation Megan had given me. When she finally closed her laptop and went upstairs to bed, I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary. I wiped down the counter twice. Then I checked the coffee machine even though I knew it was already off. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I trusted my wife. We had built 8 years of marriage on that trust. Megan had always been independent, ambitious, confident. I had always admired that about her. It was one of the reasons I fell in love with her in the first place. So why was a single email suddenly bothering me this much? Eventually, I turned off the lights and went upstairs. She was already asleep. Or at least she pretended to be. I lay beside her staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours. And somewhere in the quiet darkness of that bedroom, something strange started happening. My brain began replaying the past few months. Not the big moments. The small ones. Little things that had seemed random at the time. But now, for some reason, they started lining up in a way that made my stomach tighten. The first thing that came back to me was how often Megan had started working late. It had beg asterisk end sometime in the summer. At first, it was just occasional. A late meeting here. A last-minute project there. She would text me around 7 or 8 saying she had to stay at the office a little longer. I never questioned it. Her industry was known for long hours. But over time those late nights had become more frequent. 3 times a week. Sometimes 4. Eventually it reached a point where I was eating dinner alone more often than not. Whenever she came home, she always looked slightly rushed. Sometimes she would go straight into the bathroom with her phone in her hand before even saying hello. At the time I assumed she was just exhausted. Now I wasn't so sure. Another memory surfaced. The business trips. Megan had always traveled occasionally for conferences or client meetings. But during the past few months those trips had started happening more often. Chicago had been the 3rd trip in less than 2 months. Before that there had been a short visit to Denver. And one to Boston. Each time she explained that her agency was expanding new accounts and needed senior staff on site. Again, I believed her without hesitation. Why wouldn't I? But as I lay there in the darkness, another detail returned to me. Tyler's name. I realized I had been hearing it more and more often. Tyler thinks the client will approve the campaign. Tyler's handling the media strategy. Tyler and I might have to travel for the presentation. At the time, it sounded completely normal. Colleagues talked about each other all the time. But now that I thought about it, his name had appeared in her stories almost every single week, sometimes even daily, and somehow I had never questioned it. I shifted slightly in bed and glanced toward Megan. She was lying on her side, facing away from me, her breathing slow, steady, calm. But the more I thought about it, the more other memories started surfacing. Small things, tiny changes in her habits. For example, she had started closing her laptop the moment I walked into the room. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. People value their privacy. Still, the movement had always been quick, almost automatic, like a reflex. Her phone habits had changed too. For years, Megan had left her phone lying around the house without thinking about it. Kitchen counter, coffee table, bathroom sink. But recently she had started carrying it everywhere, even into the bathroom when she showered, even downstairs when she went to grab water in the middle of the night. One evening I had jokingly asked her if she was expecting an emergency call from the president. She laughed, said she was waiting for a message from a client. At the time I accepted the explanation immediately. Now I wasn't so sure. Then there was the perfume. That memory came back suddenly and clearly. About 3 weeks earlier, Megan had come home wearing a fragrance I didn't recognize. It was stronger than the one she normally used. Something more expensive. When I asked about it, she casually mentioned that she bought it during the Chicago trip. Duty-free, she had said with a shrug. I remembered thinking it was strange because Megan rarely bought perfume. But again, I didn't question it. Because questioning things had never been part of our marriage. Trust was. Or at least it had been. As the hours passed, the list of strange little details continued growing in my mind. Changes in her schedule. Nervous reactions when I asked about work. Shorter answers. Less conversation. Less interest in telling me about her day. At the time, all those things had seemed unrelated. Now they felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly forming a picture I didn't want to see. The worst part wasn't the suspicion itself. It was the realization that my brain was starting to connect those pieces without my permission. I didn't want to think like this. I didn't want to doubt my wife. But once the possibility appeared, it refused to disappear. Eventually, I looked over at Megan again. Her face was relaxed in sleep, completely peaceful. If someone had walked into that room in that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just a married couple resting after a long day. But inside my head, something had already started shifting. Something quiet. Something uncomfortable. A thought that I kept trying to push away. Because if that thought turned out to be true, then the life I believed I was living might not exist at all. For the next few days after that night, I forced myself to behave like nothing had changed. Megan seemed perfectly normal. She went to work early, came home late, talked about clients and deadlines, complained about traffic and office politics. If anything, she seemed slightly more cheerful than usual, like someone relieved that a tense conversation had passed without consequences. And maybe that was the most unsettling part. If something really was wrong in our marriage, she showed absolutely no signs of it. Meanwhile, inside my head, the quiet questions from that night refused to disappear. I didn't confront her again. I didn't ask more questions. Instead, I did what most people do when they're afraid of the answer. I waited. I told myself I was being irrational, that marriages go through phases, that stress from work could easily explain the changes I had noticed. For a while, that explanation almost worked. Almost. Then something happened that removed every last bit of doubt. It was a Saturday morning. Megan had left early for a meeting with a client who was visiting the city for the weekend. She rushed out of the house while finishing a phone call, barely having time to drink her coffee. I stayed home. My plan for the day was simple. clean the garage, and maybe catch up on some work reports. Nothing unusual. Around midday, I sat down at my computer in the living room to organize some photos from a hiking trip Megan and I had taken the previous year. We had a shared cloud storage account that we created a long time ago for exactly that reason. It automatically synchronized pictures from both of our phones so we could keep our family memories in one place. For years, it had been filled with ordinary things. Vacation photos, birthday parties, pictures of our dog. **TS Megan occasionally saved for design inspiration. I opened the folder expecting to see the usual random collection. Instead, something else appeared. A new folder. The timestamp showed it had been synchronized earlier that morning from Megan's phone. At first, I didn't think anything about it. Phones uploaded new images automatically all the time. But when I opened the folder, I immediately noticed something strange. The pictures weren't from our house. They weren't from a vacation. They weren't even from the city we lived in. The first image showed the inside of a hotel room. Neutral beige walls. A large window overlooking a skyline I recognized instantly. Chicago. My chest tightened slightly. Megan had stayed in a hotel during that conference trip. That part made sense. But as I clicked through the rest of the photos, the context began changing. The second picture showed the same hotel room from a different angle. This time there were 2 wine glasses on a small table near the window. One of them had lipstick marks. The third photo made my hand freeze on the mouse. Megan was in it. She stood near the window smiling at the camera. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She was wearing a black dress I had never seen before. But the most important detail wasn't the dress. It was the person standing next to her. Tyler. His arm was wrapped around her waist. And the way they were looking at each other wasn't the way coworkers looked at each other during business trips. There was no distance between them. No awkwardness. Only familiarity. Comfort. The kind of closeness that comes from spending time together in ways that have nothing to do with work. For several seconds I couldn't move. My brain tried to search for alternative explanations. Maybe it was just a friendly photo. Maybe other coworkers had been there too. Maybe. Then I opened the next image. This one removed every remaining possibility. They were sitting on the edge of the hotel bed. Tyler's hand rested on Megan's knee. She was leaning against his shoulder. Both of them smiling like they had completely forgotten that anyone else in the world existed. In that moment, something inside my chest felt like it collapsed. Not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, like a bridge giving way under too much weight. I scrolled further down the folder. More photos appeared. Some taken near the window, some near the bed, some clearly taken late at night, judging by the dark city skyline outside. Then I noticed something else. **TS. At first I didn't understand what they were. Then I opened one. It was a conversation thread. Messages between Megan and Tyler. The timestamps went back several months. Long before the Chicago trip. They talked about work at first. But the tone gradually changed. Jokes, compliments, late-night conversations, plans to meet during business trips. One message from Tyler stood out immediately. "Can't wait for Chicago. Finally, we won't have to pretend." My hands started trembling slightly. I kept reading. More messages followed. They talked about hotel reservations, about sneaking away after the conference dinner, about how no one from the office would notice if they disappeared for a few hours. The final **T was the most painful. It was a message Megan had sent him the night before their trip. "I've been thinking about this for weeks." At that moment, the last fragile piece of denial inside my mind disappeared. The quiet suspicions, the strange memories, the email I saw earlier that week. All of it suddenly connected into one undeniable truth. My wife hadn't just made a single mistake during a business trip. She had been living an entirely separate life. A life that had nothing to do with the marriage I thought we shared. And the worst part was realizing how long it had probably been happening. Months, maybe longer. I sat there staring at the screen for what felt like an hour. The house was completely silent. Outside, a car drove past slowly. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. But inside that room, time seemed to stop. Because in that moment, one thing became painfully clear. The woman I trusted most in the world had been lying to me. And the life I believed I had was never real at all. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there in front of the computer staring at the screen, as if the images might somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating if I looked at them long enough. They didn't. The hotel room, the messages, the way Tyler's arm rested comfortably around Megan's waist in those photos. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be. There was no misunderstanding, no missing context, no harmless explanation waiting to appear. My wife had been cheating on me, and judging by the messages I had just read, it wasn't something impulsive or accidental. It had been planned, carefully, quietly, for months. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. Strangely, I didn't feel the explosive anger people always describe in situations like this. There was no urge to throw the laptop across the room. No desire to call Megan immediately and demand answers. Instead, what I felt was something much colder. A slow, heavy realization spreading through my chest. It felt like the moment when someone finally accepts bad news they had been secretly expecting all along. Part of me wondered if I should confront her immediately. I could call her right then. She was probably still at that client meeting she mentioned earlier. I could send her the photos, ask her to explain, watch her try to deny something that was clearly impossible to deny. For a moment, I even imagined the conversation. The confusion in her voice, the panic when she realized I knew. But the longer I sat there thinking about it, the less appealing that idea became. What would it change? I already knew the truth. No explanation could undo the images I had just seen. No apology could erase the months of lies behind them. Eventually, I opened my eyes again and looked at the screen one last time. Then I closed the folder. Not angrily, just calmly, because something inside me had already made a decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg for honesty. I wasn't even going to ask why. Instead, I was going to leave. At first, the idea felt strange, almost surreal. Leaving your entire life behind isn't something most people consider in the middle of an ordinary Saturday afternoon. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Megan had already left our marriage long ago. She just hadn't bothered telling me. All I was doing now was catching up to a reality that had been unfolding behind my back. I stood up from the chair and walked slowly through the house. Every room suddenly looked different. The living room where we had watched movies together. The kitchen where we cooked dinner most nights. The hallway filled with framed photos from vacations and holidays. All of it now felt like a carefully staged set for a life that didn't actually exist anymore. I paused in front of one photo hanging near the stairs. It was from a beach trip we took 3 years earlier. Megan was laughing in the picture, wind blowing her hair across her face while she tried to hold onto her hat. I remembered that day clearly. At the time, I believed we were happy. Now I wasn't even sure when the truth had started changing. Eventually, I returned to the living room and sat down again. If I was going to leave, I needed a plan. Not an emotional reaction. Plan. The first thing I did was open my banking app. Megan and I shared several accounts, including the one connected to our small consulting business. Over the years, we had built a comfortable financial cushion together. I transferred half of the savings into a separate account under my name. Not out of revenge. Simply out of practicality. Next, I opened the documents related to the business itself. The consulting company had been a side project I started years earlier, providing engineering advice for small construction firms. Megan occasionally helped with marketing contacts, but most of the work had always been mine. Selling my share wouldn't be difficult. A few quick emails to the right partners would take care of it. After that, I opened my work email. The engineering firm where I worked had always treated me well. But at that moment, I realized something important. Nothing was tying me to this city anymore. No children. No obligations I couldn't leave behind. Only a marriage that had already ended without my knowledge. So I wrote a short resignation letter. I thanked them for the years we had worked together and explained that personal circumstances required me to step away from my position. My finger hovered over the send button for several seconds. Then I pressed it. The email disappeared instantly, and just like that, the first piece of my old life was gone. Over the next few hours, I continued organizing things quietly. Important documents, financial transfers, contact information for people who might help me relocate somewhere new. The strangest part was how calm everything felt. I expected grief, rage, something dramatic. Instead, there was only a quiet sense of finality, as if the decision had been forming somewhere inside me long before this day arrived. By the time Megan's car pulled into the driveway that evening, most of the important steps were already finished. I heard the garage door open, her footsteps entering the house. She called my name casually from the hallway. "Jack, you home?" I was sitting at the kitchen table finishing one final note. A single sheet of paper. Short, simple, no accusations, no explanations. When she walked into the kitchen, she looked exactly like she always did after work. Slightly tired, carrying her bag, already talking about something that happened at the office. But for the first time since I met her, I saw her differently, not as my wife, just as someone I used to know. I folded the note and placed it on the table. Then I stood up. "Hey," she said, smiling faintly. "You wouldn't believe the day I had." "I'm going out for a bit," I said calmly. She barely looked up. "Okay," she replied. "Don't be late. I still need to show you something funny Tyler sent." Her voice faded behind me as I walked toward the door. And just like that, without a single argument, without a single accusation, I stepped out of my old life for the last time. The first few days after I left felt unreal. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just strangely quiet. I drove for hours that first night without any real destination. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, the steady rhythm of the road humming beneath the tires while the city lights slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. I didn't answer my phone. In fact, sometime during the drive I turned it off completely. I didn't want to hear Megan's voice. I didn't want explanations, apologies, or questions. None of those things could change what had already happened. For the first time in years, the only thing I wanted was silence. By the second day of driving, I had crossed several state lines. Somewhere along the way, I stopped checking the map carefully and simply followed smaller highways heading north. The further I drove, the emptier the roads became. Cities turned into towns. Towns turned into quiet stretches of forest and coastline. Eventually, I found myself in a small coastal town in Maine. I had never planned to go there. The decision happened almost randomly when I stopped for gas and saw the ocean for the first time in years. There was something calming about it. The slow movement of the water, the smell of salt in the air, the steady sound of waves hitting the rocks. For a moment, I just stood there near the shore watching the horizon, letting the wind push against my jacket while gulls circled above the harbor. And for the first time since discovering the truth about Megan, my mind felt slightly lighter. I ended up renting a small room above a bait shop near the marina. The place was simple. One narrow bed, a small wooden desk, a window that looked directly out toward the harbor where fishing boats came and went throughout the day. It wasn't comfortable in the way my old house had been, but it felt honest. Nothing about it reminded me of the life I had just left behind. During the first week, I spent most of my time walking along the docks or sitting near the water watching the boats leave early in the morning. Fishermen moved with the kind of routine that only comes from years of doing the same work. Untying ropes, checking nets, preparing engines before sunrise. Their lives looked physically exhausting, but also strangely peaceful. No office politics, no endless emails, no pretending. One afternoon, while watching a group of boats return to the harbor, I struck up a conversation with an older man named Carl who worked as a navigation instructor for local fishing tours. The job involved teaching tourists and inexperienced sailors how to handle small boats along the coastline. Carl had the weathered face of someone who had spent decades on the ocean. When he asked what brought me to the town, I gave a simple answer. Needed a change. He studied me for a moment, then nodded like he understood more than I had said out loud. A few days later, he mentioned that they were looking for another instructor. Apparently, the summer tourist season was approaching, and many visitors wanted guided fishing trips along the coast. The work wasn't complicated, mostly explaining basic navigation, safety procedures, and how to handle smaller boats in open water. At first, the idea sounded completely ridiculous. A few weeks earlier, I had been working as an engineer inside an office building surrounded by blueprints and computer models. Now someone was offering me a job teaching strangers how to fish. But the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. The ocean didn't care about my past. It didn't care about broken marriages or betrayal. Out there on the water, the only things that mattered were wind, current, and experience. So I accepted. The work was physically demanding. Most mornings started before sunrise. Tourists arrived half asleep carrying coolers and cameras while asking basic questions about tides and navigation. My job was to guide them through the process. How to steer the boat. How to read the horizon. How to stay calm if the weather changed suddenly. Some days the sea was perfectly calm. Other days the waves were rough enough to make even experienced sailors cautious. But strangely, I enjoyed all of it. The movement of the boat, the cold wind against my face, the constant attention required to read the water. It forced my mind to stay focused on the present moment. There was no room for overthinking, no room for memories. Little by little, the thoughts about Megan began appearing less often. At first her face would return to my mind whenever the sun set over the water. Then the memories started fading. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually the routine of the harbor replaced the routine of my old life. I learned the names of local fishermen, the best places along the coast where fish gathered during certain tides, which weather patterns meant rough water later in the afternoon. The town itself remained small and quiet. People greeted each other by name. Local restaurants closed early, and most evenings ended with the same peaceful view of the harbor lights reflecting across the dark surface of the ocean. It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself, but in many ways, it was exactly the life I needed, because somewhere between the early mornings on the water and the quiet nights by the harbor, something inside me slowly began healing. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to realize something important. The humiliation I had carried for so long during my marriage didn't have to follow me into the future, and for the first time in many months, I started to believe that my life wasn't over. It was simply beginning again. Nearly a year passed before Megan finally found me. I was tying ropes at the marina when I heard my name behind me. Her voice sounded unfamiliar in the quiet harbor air. When I turned around, she looked nothing like the confident woman I remembered. Tired, nervous. She said Tyler was gone, her job had collapsed after a scandal, and most of her colleagues had distanced themselves. Only then, she said, did she realize how much she had destroyed. Listening to her, I felt no anger anymore, only distance. The ocean moved quietly behind us while she apologized for everything. The lies, the arrogance, the years she mocked my calmness. But the life she was asking for no longer existed. I had already built something new here. When she finally finished speaking, I simply told her I hoped she would find a way to rebuild her own life too. Then I walked back to the boats, leaving the past where it belonged.